All right, I can't lie. I'm a sad boy in the winter, especially where I'm at up in Seattle. It's kind of rough. The days are cold, it's always wet, and even on a non-cloudy day, the sun is up for like maybe 2 seconds. So, of course, as anyone that doesn't live in California or Florida would do right now, I start to reminisce. I start thinking back to warmer days, better summers, and every time I start looking back, I always think to one specific summer. I can't ever remember the exact year, but I had to be around 11 or 12 at the time. I remember all I did for the greater part of 3 months that school was out was wake up, play 2K. Once I got bored of that, I would go outside, play basketball until I got tired, come back inside, play NBA Live until I got tired, went back outside, hooped again, and then just sort of repeated the cycle. I did that for pretty much all 3 months. And surprisingly, didn't catch much flack for it from my mom, given how good my grades were at the time. The boy was a smart kid. And before he started bagging on me for being a loner, keep in mind I had just switched schools and most of my friends lived on the other side of town, too far for me to hop on my mongoose bike and ride over. They still around? They still make those? Now here's the thing. If young me was born 5 years earlier or 5 years later, I would have had a much different experience. Had I been born 5 years later, that summer would have been me just being stuck playing NBA 2K instead of NBA 2K and NBA Live. 5 years earlier, I would have had so many other games to choose from. Not just NBA Live and NBA 2K, but also games like NBA Inside Drive, ESPN, NBA 2Night, and NBA ShootOut. Some of those games I never even knew existed. But that's 5 different licensed NBA simulations that were all competing with one another. And that's not including games like NBA Ballers and, of course, the GOAT, NBA Street. So what happened? Why did all of these franchises end up disappearing? At a high level, we know, as with most things on this channel, it has something to do with finances. And for most of these franchises, at some point they came to the realization that it just didn't make financial sense to continue. 5 NBA games is an extremely crowded market. There can't be any reasonable expectation for consumers, even diehard NBA fans, to buy 5 different simulations, let alone be aware of all the different options. So, of course, some of these had to go. This is similar to any budding industry. At the start, you'll see a number of different competitors, but quickly, they'll either consolidate and partner up with one another, or go out of business, leaving consumers with a fraction of the options they had before. Take the mobile phone industry, for example. A little over a decade ago, you not only had a ton of variety in terms of the phones you could choose from, an option I'd argue still exists today, but also a ton of variety in terms of the operating system you could use. At one point, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Samsung, BlackBerry, Nokia, LG, and Motorola not only made their own devices, which they all still do today, but they also had their own operating systems. But as market dynamics changed and developers didn't want to support 7 different app stores when creating an app, the market consolidated to where it is now, iOS or Android. Too many options causes unnecessary friction. And eventually, the market decides who can stay and who can go. And that's how we are where we are with NBA games today. In a short period of time, we went from having 5 different simulations at the start of the millennium to 2, and for the time being, 1 single game in NBA 2K. So how did we get here? What happened to the rest of the games? We know at the end of the day it comes down to finances. You usually don't cancel a game that's turning a profit. But what caused them to get brushed off to the side in favor of the other options in the market? To do that, let's look at each of these games in a bit more detail. Let's go in order of which games were canceled first, and we'll start with ESPN NBA 2Night, which was developed by Konami. The first iteration of this game was actually called NBA in the Zone, which was introduced in 1998 for the Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation. I actually had that first game. This was when Michael Jordan was still in the league, but wouldn't provide his likeness to video games. So developers had to come up with creative ways to work around this. This game obviously did the most logical thing, replacing Michael Jordan with a white guy named Roster Guard, who wore number 80 and had no photo. Again, they were taking no chances of getting sued over here. Now, it's been a couple of decades since I played this game, so I could be totally wrong here, but I do recall him still being the highest rated player in the game, which had to be a first for any white guy in the history of basketball video games. The franchise struggled for a few years, and by the turn of the millennium, they were desperate for a splash. So in 2001, Konami splurged, buying the licensing rights to use ESPN in their games. And buddy, did they take full advantage of that. ESPN was in every inch of this game. Had you not known any better, you would have thought ESPN developed this game themselves. First thing that changed, of course, was the name, where they went from NBA in the Zone to ESPN NBA 2Night, which was a nightly show that was airing on ESPN at the time. Now, I didn't know that show existed. We didn't have cable growing up, we just had the little bunny ears. But I thought the name was so cool that I named my first email after it. That email was called mac_2night@yahoo.com. Mac, of course, being the nickname I gave myself when I was 10. Leave me alone. But okay, back to the ESPN part. They flooded it with the ESPN branding. It was no longer just main menu, it was ESPN main menu. And it was no longer just Team Select, it was ESPN Team Select. Now, this did make a lot more sense in the in-game experience, where it does honestly add a good level of authenticity to the gameplay. All the graphics in-game would be the exact same that you would see if you were watching an ESPN broadcast from 2001. And they even included Brent Musburger and Stuart Scott as commentators. But that's about where the positives end. The game, even for its time, was pretty bad. Like, really bad. Now, okay, it's time for a concession. And this is probably the most important one yet. I could definitely go off memory and gameplay videos as much as I want, but to be fair, I've had 2 decades of better basketball games that cleanse my palate from a lot of these games that we're going to be talking about. So when I pass judgment, I'll also make sure to include either Metacritic scores or game ranking scores, which are aggregate scores of all the different ratings that these games have gotten at the time. And we'll include those when we're talking about each of these games to add a bit more context around what the reception was about these games at the time. Now, with all that in mind, I will still say this game was trash, and reviewers agreed. It received a 29 on Metacritic. That's 29 out of 100. IGN gave it a 1 out of 10 in what has to be one of the funniest and harshest reviews I've ever read. I don't want to derail the video too much, but it is honestly one of the funniest things I've ever read in my life. I'm going to link it in the description below. Trust me when I say this, it's worth a read. It's short, it's funny, it's comical. Trust me, just give it a good read. Now, to be fair, the game did do a bit better on the PS2, given that that was their next generation version of the game. Still not great, it got a 62 out of 100 on Metacritic, but that's more than double what they got on the Sega Dreamcast. Now, while the game looked good, it lacked a ton of features, even for its time. There wasn't even a franchise mode, which was commonplace in all the other competitors' games that allow users to manage teams like they would if they were the general manager of a team, making trades, signing players in free agency, etc., and not just playing quick games. Another knock on the game was that it only released on PS2, having missed the boat on both the Nintendo GameCube and the Microsoft Xbox. As a result, the game didn't sell very well, being that it was restricted to just one platform, whereas most of the competition was on all the platforms. So after another year of bad reviews, limited distribution, minimal awareness from consumers, and poor sales, the series was canceled, and Konami's short run of making NBA simulations ended there. Okay, also one more fun memory from this game. There was this weird quirk where you could sometimes dunk from the 3-point line. So me and my cousin would go back and forth, not trying to score the most points, but see who at the end of the game could get the most 3-point line dunks in the game. It was 100% a glitch, and would happen infrequently enough that when it happened, we would go crazy. Like, we would run around the house. We would be like, as if we scored our own touchdown. It was wild. It was wild. Good times. Anyway, I'm definitely not telling you the story just to make you think that I wasn't a total loner as a kid. Right? That's definitely not my intention. Okay, anyway, enough about this game. On to the next mediocre basketball simulation. NBA Inside Drive is the next game we'll take a look at. This game was actually pretty solid, with all the games receiving ratings ranging from 70 to 75 on Metacritic. Full disclosure, I didn't own any of the games in this series, but my best friend did. Enough so that I can definitely, absolutely, wholeheartedly give an informed review almost 20 years later. Because yes, my memory is that good. The series was developed by Microsoft and started out in 1999, though it was only available on PC. The game, yeah, it looked like most every other 3D sports game in the late 90s. Really bad. A lot of rectangles and box shoulders and really weird, ugly faces. I don't honestly know how we put up with this, man. Like, were we really this oblivious to how bad these games looked? But anyways, Microsoft took a 2.5-year hiatus on the development of this game. They were preparing to release a new console soon called the Xbox, weird name, and they were putting together a much larger game studio to support that console with some exclusives, including games like Halo, as well as sports games like NFL Fever, a hockey simulation called NHL Rivals, and of course, resurrecting NBA Inside Drive. The new game was entirely different from the old. New player models, new features, same commentators, but they actually did provide some semblance of genuine logical commentary, which was provided by Kenny Smith and Kevin Calabro, who was also the Seattle Supersonics commentator at the time. And speaking of oh my goodness. And speaking of Supersonics, and speaking of Supersonics, and speaking of Supersonics, and speaking of Supersonics, it would be a real shame if you checked out this other video I made about the Sonics and their relocation to Oklahoma City, but not until this video is finished. You are trapped here with me until then. Now, like NBA 2Night, Inside Drive was also exclusive to one of the next-gen consoles, but this was actually intentional. Strategic, even. The Xbox was the only one of the 3 major consoles to support real online play. You could technically do it on the PlayStation 2, but it definitely wasn't built for it, and it was a really sketchy experience. And the GameCube, well, they kind of always did their own thing anyway. So Microsoft wanted to develop a game that could take advantage of this new online play that they were offering and present it as an exclusive on the platform. Oh, you want to play an NBA game online against your friends who aren't in the same room as you? Maybe those friends that live on the other side of town who you can't see anymore during your summers because you just switched schools and you can't ride your mongoose bike that far? Well, we have a solution. Jeez, that was horrible. They had actually initially tried convincing EA to support online play for their upcoming consoles. But when EA refused, that's when Microsoft decided to take matters into their own hands and build their own games, as a real company should. And again, the game was good, much better than NBA 2Night, but not good enough for Microsoft's high standards. Also, to be honest, they likely weren't selling enough copies because, again, like NBA 2Night, by choice or by circumstance, they were exclusive to one platform. Also, in 2 more years, Microsoft would be releasing the Xbox 360, a console EA did agree that they would support for online play. So seeing that Microsoft had admitted that they were unhappy with the quality of their game, also seeing that the game wasn't selling well, and online play would be supported by EA in a little over a year's time on their new console, Microsoft decided to cancel all of their sports games in their studio, including NHL Rivals, NHL Fever, and yes, NBA Inside Drive. Keep in mind, while EA might seem like a competitor, Microsoft still gets a cut out of every one of those sales that happen on the Xbox. Maybe not as much as if they were selling their own game, but they still get a pretty decent percentage. For every $60 first-party game sold, Sony and Microsoft on average make about $27 per game. In contrast, for every third-party game sold, they make roughly $7 per game. So yes, it's a pretty big dip, but at the end of the day, they're still making a killing. And now they don't have to worry about the costs to make their own game. They can just take a piece of all the other NBA games that are being sold on their platform. And speaking of other games, let's jump on to the next one. And this one is one a lot of you might remember. It had gone through 2 different names, but both were developed in-house by Sony. So we're calling it one game. Don't hate the player. In 1996, Sony released NBA ShootOut. Yes, another NBA game exclusive to one console. I think we know how this one ends. The first cover was, of course, Sam Cassell, because who else from 1996 would you possibly want to put on a cover of your inaugural video game? From 1996 to 2000, the game did well for the most part, with one exception, which was NBA ShootOut 99. Sony, and I quote, canceled it 2 weeks before the launch because of a lack of quality. Sony canceled it because the game sucked. Again, I don't really know how you judge these late 90s basketball games from one another. They all just kind of look the same to me. But hey, obviously someone could, because 2 years before that, in the second year of development, they released NBA ShootOut 97, which received a whopping 87 out of 100. That's the highest rating we've seen yet, and one of the highest rated sports games ever. Also, side note, it's almost comical how many people worked on these games. NBA ShootOut 97 had 9 people working on the game. 9 people. 4 programmers, 3 artists, and 2 composers. Did I get my fingers right? And they built one of the highest rated basketball games ever of all time. I can barely edit a video. Anyway, okay, back to NBA ShootOut. After canceling the previous year's game in 1999, they spent an extra year working on fixing all of the quality issues in the game. And in 2000, they come back with quite literally the exact same game. I cannot tell the difference between this and any of the other games that they had released. But okay, praise God, the next year we get hit with a new generation of consoles, which provides us with a new generation of games, and with it, new graphics, gameplay, all that good stuff. And again, the game does look much better than its previous generation of counterpart, but nowhere near the competition from NBA Inside Drive and NBA Live. Also, the game did this really annoying thing where it would just play this recurring track of players' shoes squeaking on the floor.
Unable to convert the jumper. Richmond.
Anyway, the highest rating the PS2 version of this game got was a 62 for NBA ShootOut 2003. The rest of the games never cracked past the 50s. The general sentiment regarding these games from all the reviews that I read were that they were fun to play and had some interesting features, but the graphics and the gameplay were just too outdated for its time. One reviewer was even cited as saying that they had to look twice to see if perhaps the copy of the game was actually a PS1 version accidentally packaged in a PS2 wrapper. Frankly, this game plays so poorly, I'm surprised that it's not in a cartridge. Now, I think that's quite a bit exaggerated. I actually think that the game plays quite well, and you get to hear Bill Walton commentate in all his glory.
Count it. They've got to give him help on that. He'll make that shot all day long.
Anyways, after 2004, the game gets canceled. Well, no, sorry. It gets rebranded. Similar to Microsoft, Sony was preparing to release its next-gen console, the PS3. And again, similar to Microsoft with the original Xbox, Sony wanted to offer an exclusive to PlayStation gamers that would lure them to the console with something of a differentiating factor. By the time the PS3 had rolled around, online play was going to be a given. So the differentiating factor that they had selected was, well, a story mode. Yes, story mode. Just like my player today on NBA 2K. Complete with cutscenes and all. And to be honest, it actually wasn't that bad. Now, oddly enough, the story mode that was supposed to be this differentiating feature only appeared in the PS2 version for the first year of this game. NBA 07 on the PS3 was pretty bare bones. Sony mentioned that they were focused on improving the gameplay, which I believe is just French for we ran out of time. But the story mode was pretty extensive, even by today's standard. For example, in NBA 09, you had the option to play through 3 different players' stories, detailing their rise from the NBA D-League all the way to the NBA. Also, again, the stories were half decent. Like, you can go on YouTube and watch like just the cutscenes, and it's a pretty good story. But anyways, the series continued until 2009. With NBA 09 The Inside. This was the highest rated game of the series, though it only garnered a 63 on Metacritic. Why was the game canceled? Well, okay. We've explored part of the reason already. Poor sales and low adoption primarily due to exclusivity. NBA Live and NBA 2K were available on all platforms, which provided them a much bigger audience, and more incentives for people to buy the game. But there was another reason as well, and we'll get into this in the next video, but I do think it's important to touch on here. Thus far, all the games that we've looked at have generally been canceled due to either poor quality, poor sales, poor reception and awareness from the gaming community, or just simple market dynamics such as an upcoming console that incentivized a change in strategy. But there's something to be said about why these games also manage to last as long as they do. The NBA ShootOut series lasted for more than a decade, which is a long time for any gaming franchise by any standard. And this was a game that wasn't selling well, but it lasted for a very long time. Now, I don't know if you recall, but I joked earlier about how some of these games were so similar one year to the next that I couldn't tell much of a difference except for the score bug and maybe some roster changes. But quite honestly, even today, that's still very much the case. Studios don't build games from the ground up each year. The player models that they build are usually built for the entirety of that generation. Sure, there's a lot of polishing that happens, slight improvements in gameplay, better face scans, new features, etc., but the core game is still the same. The majority of investment happens when a game is first being developed. Every iteration following that are usually just incremental changes. And in case you're wondering just how small those changes really are, I've been switching back and forth between gameplay footage from NBA 2K14 and NBA 2K21. There's almost a decade difference between the two games, and honestly, I can barely see any difference. So you might ask, why is it then that NBA 2K is able to ride it out for the length of a generation with practically the same game, whereas others aren't? And that, my friend, is when we get into licensing. If you're gonna make an NBA game, you have to have the rights to the NBA, and that doesn't come cheap. For example, the NBA re-upped their contract with developers in 2011. We don't have exact figures, but estimates say that they were roughly $500 million in licensing the NBA and the Players Association charged in order to use the league, the name, the teams, player likeness, etc. in the game. The target number is generally 10 to 15% of total revenue for these games. So based on that, they came up with $500 million. And you know who was absent in those negotiations? You guessed it, our good friends over at Sony. Sony had made the initial investment of developing the NBA games with the hopes that they would gain traction while they still maintain the rights to the NBA license. Even though the games weren't selling well, they could, just like every other sports developer out there, release largely the same game with minimal marketing and recoup some of their initial investment. This was also likely the case with our friends over at Konami and NBA 2Night. I'm certain early on that Sony was aware that they weren't going to re-up their new contract. The series was consistently one of the lowest selling games out of the 3 remaining NBA franchises. And with 2K introducing My Player and more robust creative player experience, Sony's single differentiating factor was no longer a differentiating factor. Sony's NBA series just wasn't a selling point to attract users to buy a PS3 over an Xbox anymore. And given that by 2011, that generation of consoles had neared the end of their lives, most of the sales from those consoles had already been realized. And both Sony and Microsoft were preparing for the launch of their next-gen consoles, the PS4 and the Xbox One. So it just didn't make sense to spend more money on that new license if they weren't going to continue investing in the game and bring it into the new console generation, where they would again not only have to pay for a new license, but to compete with NBA Live and NBA 2K, they would also need to invest and build a new game from the ground up. They wouldn't be able to use the same assets year over year like they had on the previous generation. So they put the series on live support, did very little marketing or updates to the game to maximize their margins, and waited until their contract ended before officially calling it quits. Now, okay, I do think this is a good place to put a pause on this discussion. We touched quite a bit on what happened to the games that were canceled. I do want to make sure I do justice by EA Sports and 2K Sports, both of whom really influenced the gaming landscape more than any other sports gaming franchise, I would argue, ever. Also, the economics behind both those games are quite a bit more complicated. So I think it makes sense, for the sake of this video and for the sake of my sanity, to break this into two parts. I don't know if it'll be the next video, but eventually we'll be taking a look at Visual Concepts, the parent company of 2K, and understand how 2K has managed to build a monopoly in the market of basketball video games, and why they may go a very long time without ever having to face any competition in the market. And it's more than just what you think. So if you want to see that video, make sure to subscribe. That way you'll get a notification when that new video drops, and you'll be able to get the second part of the story. Otherwise, I want to thank y'all so much. This was another trip down memory lane. I'm really hitting y'all with a lot of nostalgia recently, man. Y'all learning a lot about me. Otherwise, I just want to say thank y'all again for A, making it through this video, B, for any and all the support that I can get. Please make sure to subscribe, like, and comment below. Again, I say this every time. I don't like asking, but it's the only way we get this thing to continue to grow. So eventually, hopefully, I'll get to a point where that stuff doesn't matter as much and I can just focus on the content. But in the meantime, help me out. Anything you can do is greatly appreciated. And trust me, I can't thank each and every one of you enough. Thank y'all so much. All right, y'all. Love y'all. Peace.